My name is Maddie Carter, and I'm 27 years old. This happened in the summer of 2023, deep in the Umpqua National Forest near Toketee Falls. I'm a grad student studying wildlife biology, so camping and hiking are second nature to me. I'm not one to scare easily. The stories of skinwalkers, ghosts, and forest spirits are just that. Stories. Or at least, that's what I believed before this trip. It started as a routine outing. My best friend Kara and my older brother Lucas joined me for what was supposed to be a peaceful, 3-day camping trip. Kara, a freelance photographer, wanted to capture the forest's raw beauty for her portfolio. Lucas tagged along because, well, he needed the break. After leaving the fire department a year ago, he'd been struggling with PTSD and figured some fresh air and family time might help. We packed my old RV and drove out on a Friday morning. The sun was shining and the forest was alive with the buzz of summer insects and birdsong. None of us had any idea what was waiting for us. We arrived at Toketee Falls by noon. The area was breathtaking. Towering trees, a cascading waterfall, and the kind of quiet that makes you feel small in the best way. We set up camp about a mile off a trail, a spot I'd chosen for its proximity to a deer migration path I wanted to observe. It didn't take long for the first hiccup to appear. My GPS started acting weird. It kept recalculating, spinning wildly as if it couldn't decide which direction was north. I chalked it up to bad signal in the forest, but Kara's camera batteries were also inexplicably drained. Lucas brushed it off, saying, "Murphy's Law, right? What can go wrong will go wrong." We spent the afternoon exploring. Kara snapped photos of unusual trees, some of which had strange markings carved into their bark, curved lines that reminded me of old petroglyphs. Lucas found an animal track that looked like a deer's, but something about it was off. The prints were too elongated, the spacing too irregular. "It's just a weird deer," I said, but Lucas's expression stayed serious. By evening, we gathered around the fire for dinner. Kara started telling ghost stories, her favorite pastime during our trips, and talked about Navajo legends of skinwalkers, malevolent shapeshifters who mimic voices to lure victims. Lucas rolled his eyes, and I dismissed it as nonsense, but I couldn't help noticing how the forest seemed unnaturally still as night fell. The second day started uneventfully. Kara and I tracked deer trails while Lucas stayed at camp to relax. Around mid-afternoon, we returned to find him sitting by the fire pit, staring into the flames. He looked pale, his jaw tight. "You okay?" I asked. "Thought I saw you earlier," he said without looking up. "By the river." I frowned. "We haven't been near the river." He finally met my gaze, and I saw unease in his eyes. Then who the hell was I looking at? Kara laughed nervously. Probably just a shadow or another hiker. Lucas didn't respond. I could tell he wasn't convinced, but he let it go. That evening, things got stranger. While we sat around the fire, I heard someone call my name from the trees. "Maddie," the voice whispered, soft and urgent. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my heart racing. "Hear what?" Kara looked up from her camera. "Someone just called my name." Lucas stood, scanning the dark forest. "Probably your imagination. Sound carries weird out here." But the voice came again, and this time, Kara heard it too. "That's freaky," she muttered, clutching her camera like it was a weapon. The rational part of me wanted to believe it was an echo or a trick of the wind. But deep down, I knew better. By morning, we were all on edge. The plan was to pack up and leave by midday, but Kara insisted on one last photo hike. Lucas reluctantly agreed, but his eyes kept darting toward the tree line as if he expected something to emerge at any moment. As we walked, Kara veered off the trail to photograph a strange formation of stones. They were arranged in a circle, each marked with the same curved lines we'd seen on the trees. "Don't touch them," Lucas warned, his voice sharp. Kara rolled her eyes but took a step back. "Relax, they're just rocks." We moved on, but the air felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. That's when I saw it, a figure standing between the trees, its outline blurry, almost shimmering. It looked human, but something about its movements was wrong. Too smooth, too deliberate. "Do you see that?" I whispered. Lucas nodded, his jaw clenched. "Stay behind me." The figure vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the unease lingered. By the time we returned to camp, it was clear we weren't alone in the woods. The snapping of branches, the faint whispers, the distorted animal tracks. It all pointed to one thing. Something was watching us. That night, none of us could sleep. The fire cast long shadows that seemed to dance with malicious intent. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig sent shivers down my spine. Around midnight, I heard Kara whisper, "Do you hear that?" A low, guttural growl echoed through the forest. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. Lucas grabbed his hunting knife and stood, his eyes scanning the darkness. The growl came again, closer this time. Then we saw it. A creature stepping into the firelight. Its form shifted between that of a deer and a human, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, predatory light. "Get behind me!" Lucas shouted. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream that sent us stumbling back. It charged at Lucas, but he held his ground, slashing at it with his knife. The blade seemed to slow it, but not stop it. I grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it wildly, forcing the creature to retreat into the shadows. "We have to leave now," Lucas barked, his voice trembling. We abandoned most of our gear and bolted for the trailhead. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in around us. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the forest itself was trying to trap us. At one point, Lucas stopped and turned to face the darkness. "Go! I'll hold it off." "No!" I screamed, but he shoved me forward. "Don't argue, just run." Kara and I didn't look back. The sound of Lucas's shouts and the creature's growls faded as we ran. By the time we reached the RV, I was shaking so hard I could barely get the keys in the ignition. Kara was sobbing, clutching her camera like it was a lifeline. We found Lucas hours later, staggering out of the forest, bloodied but alive. He refused to talk about what happened, and I didn't press him. We drove straight home, leaving behind the wreckage of our trip and a part of ourselves. To this day, I can still hear the whispers when I close my eyes. They call my name, soft and urgent, as if the forest hasn't quite let go of me. My name is Jenna Marks, and I'm 34 years old. I'm an illustrator, mostly working on graphic novels and children's books. This happened last summer, in July 2023, when I decided to take my RV to Willamette National Forest near Clear Lake, Oregon. I was looking for peace and inspiration after a nasty breakup that left me feeling untethered. I've always loved nature, especially places with deep histories. That's why I chose Clear Lake. It was supposed to be beautiful and calming, but it turned out to be anything but. The drive up was uneventful, a ribbon of winding roads lined with towering pines. I reached the campground by late afternoon. It was quieter than I expected, not another camper in sight. It struck me as odd. It was peak camping season, but the solitude was a welcome change. I parked my RV in a spot overlooking the lake, its water so clear you could see the rocks on the bottom. As I set up camp, I noticed the air was cooler than I'd expected, and by dusk, a thick fog began rolling in. It crept across the lake's surface and wound through the trees, swallowing everything. My headlights barely cut through it when I went to retrieve my sketch pad from the RV. I told myself it was just weather, a normal part of the region's charm, but something about the fog felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing in on me. That first night, as I sat in the dim glow of my lantern, I heard it. Laughter. Soft, high-pitched giggles, faint and fleeting. I froze, my pen hovering over the sketch I was working on. It sounded like children, but when I looked out the window I saw nothing but swirling mist. "It's just the wind," I muttered, shaking off the unease. Still, I locked the door before climbing into bed. By morning, the fog had mostly lifted, leaving the lake sparkling under the sun. I spent the day exploring the shoreline, taking photos for reference. The quiet was almost eerie. No bird calls, no distant hum of hikers or boaters, just the crunch of my boots on the pebbles and the occasional ripple of water. That's when I saw it. A rusted tin car, half buried in the mud near the water. Nearby was a doll, its plastic face worn and missing one eye. I bent down to pick it up, a chill running down my spine as I turned it over in my hands. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect to find out here, miles from any playground or home. I glanced around, half expecting to see a child sprinting toward me to reclaim their lost toy. But the beach was empty. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That evening, the fog returned, thicker than before. I stayed inside the RV, sketching by the lantern's glow. I was halfway through a drawing of the lake when I realized the lines on the paper were smudging. I ran my fingers over the page and they came away damp. I turned to grab a dry sheet when something caught my eye. Wet footprints leading from the RV door to my bed. My breath caught in my throat. The door was locked, and I hadn't left all evening. I told myself I was imagining things, but I kept my hunting knife close by as I crawled into bed. The next morning, I ventured into the nearest town, hoping for answers. I stopped at the small ranger station, where an older man named Frank greeted me. "Clear Lake's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, handing me a map of the trails. "It is, but I found some old toys by the water. Do people leave them there on purpose?" Frank's face darkened. "Toys, huh? Been a while since someone mentioned that. You ever hear about the accident?" "What accident?" I asked, leaning closer. "Back in the 1920s, a group of kids came up here on a summer outing. Canoe tipped over in the middle of the lake. Water's so cold it doesn't take long. None of 'em made it out." He sighed, his expression grim. "Locals say their spirits linger, that they like to play." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "Ghost kids? Come on." "Believe what you want," Frank said, shrugging, "but I wouldn't stay there after dark." I thanked him and headed back, unsettled but determined to prove him wrong. The rest of the day passed uneventfully until dusk. The fog returned, rolling in like a tide, and the laughter began again. Only this time it was louder, closer. I stepped outside with a flashlight, scanning the shoreline. That's when I saw them. Pale, translucent figures of children darting through the mist. Their faces were expressionless, their movements jerky like old film reels. One of them stopped and turned to look at me, its hollow eyes locking with mine. "Come play," it whispered, its voice soft but echoing in my head. I bolted back into the RV, slamming the door shut. I stayed up all night, the children's giggles echoing outside, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. By the fourth evening, I'd had enough. I packed my things and tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked everything: fuel, battery, connections, but it was as if the vehicle itself was refusing to leave. As darkness fell, the fog grew so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I locked the doors and huddled inside, but the children's voices grew louder. They were everywhere, calling my name, tapping on the windows, laughing. At one point, I heard a splash and looked out to see small, glowing orbs floating above the lake. They hovered there, bobbing gently, before drifting toward the shore. The RV began to rock, as if unseen hands were pushing it. Desperate, I remembered what Frank had said about the children's spirits being restless. I grabbed my sketch pad and started drawing. A memorial for the lost kids. It was a rush job, shaky lines and smudged shading, but I poured my heart into it. When I was done, I stepped out into the fog, clutching the drawing. "I'm sorry," I whispered, placing the sketch on the ground near the water. "You deserve to be remembered." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the fog began to lift, the laughter fading into silence. The orbs blinked out, one by one, leaving the lake still and calm. The RV started the next morning, as if nothing had happened. I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I haven't been back to Clear Lake since, but sometimes when I'm sketching alone in my studio, I hear faint giggles. And every now and then I find damp handprints on my paper. My name is Eric Hall, and I'm 29 years old. Last summer, I drove my RV to Smith Rock State Park in Oregon. I was chasing something I didn't fully understand. A sense of redemption, maybe, or just a way to escape the guilt that's been following me ever since Greg fell. Greg was my climbing partner, my best friend. He died on a climb I'd planned, and I couldn't save him. The accident wasn't my fault, but it feels like it was. This trip was supposed to be about proving I could still do it, that I could climb, that I could be in control. But Smith Rock didn't give me redemption. It gave me something else. Something worse. I reached the park just before noon on a blistering August day. Smith Rock looked surreal, its jagged spires jutting into a perfect blue sky. The air smelled of sagebrush and dust, and cicadas buzzed in the heat. My RV felt like an oven by the time I parked in a pullout overlooking the spires. The place was strangely empty. No other cars, no climbers gearing up. Odd, but I wasn't complaining. I wanted solitude. My goal was simple. Solo, the devil's teeth. The name came from the formation's serrated peaks, a route infamous among climbers for its difficulty and danger. Few attempted it without a partner, but I didn't have one anymore. On the first day, I set out early, gear jangling as I hiked to the base of the spires. The heat was brutal even in the morning, and the rock was sharper than I'd expected, slicing at my hands as I ascended. The climb was harder than I'd imagined. My fingers cramped, my legs shook, and halfway up I almost slipped. The crack I'd trusted shifted under my weight, sending a spray of pebbles cascading below. My heart pounded, and for a second I froze. Greg's voice came to me clear as day. "That's why you check every hold, dumbass." I laughed nervously, shaking my head. Just stress and dehydration playing tricks. Still, it rattled me. I finished the climb and returned to the RV feeling uneasy, though I told myself it was just nerves. That night, I sat outside my RV, watching the sun dip below the spires. The rocks glowed orange, then red, like they were on fire. As the light faded, shadows stretched long and sharp across the ground. They seemed to move, flickering like they had a life of their own. I was startled by a sound, a low whisper carried on the breeze. It was faint, almost indistinct, but it made the hair on my arms stand up. I turned off my lantern, trying to focus. The whisper came again, rising and falling like words spoken just out of reach. I told myself it was the wind. But when I stepped back into the RV, I found my climbing harness on the floor, even though I'd hung it on a hook. The next day, I visited the nearest gas station for more water and snacks. The place was nearly empty, except for the cashier, an older man with leathery skin and tired eyes. "Climbing Smith?" he asked as he rang me up. "Yeah, the devil's teeth," I said, trying to sound casual. The man stopped mid-scan, his expression darkening. "You shouldn't mess with that route." "Why not?" I asked, trying not to roll my eyes. "Old stories," he said, leaning on the counter. "Native people around here used to call it Chayak Tut, spirit of the rock, said it punishes the proud and the reckless." I forced a laugh. "I think I'll take my chances." The man's eyes narrowed. "It's not just stories, kid. People have died on those spires. Not all of them accidents." I thanked him and left, but his words stuck with me as I drove back to the campground. By the time I reached the RV, the shadows were already creeping in. That night, the whispers came back, louder this time. They seemed to rise from the rocks themselves, a low, guttural chant that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to ignore it, but as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps circling the RV. Slow, deliberate. "Hello?" I called, grabbing my headlamp and stepping outside. Nothing but darkness greeted me. The spires loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks silhouetted against the stars. I swore I saw something move, an impossibly tall figure perched on one of the rocks, watching me. I shut the door and locked it, heart hammering in my chest. On the third day, I decided to finish the devil's teeth. I wanted to prove I could do it, that I wasn't afraid. I set out early, climbing with precision and focus, but the higher I went, the worse the whispers became. They were in my head now, an unrelenting chorus of voices. Some sounded like Greg, others were deeper, darker, speaking a language I didn't understand. Halfway up, the rock beneath my hand crumbled and I nearly fell. My harness held, but when I looked down, I saw claw marks gouged into the rock. 3 deep, parallel lines that hadn't been there before. "Just your imagination," I muttered. But my voice shook. When I finally reached the summit, the air was unnaturally still. The sun blazed overhead, but the shadows felt cold. And there, standing at the edge of the peak, was the figure I'd seen the night before. It wasn't human. Its body was gaunt, its skin as black and cracked as the rock. 2 jagged horns curved from its head, and its eyes burned like molten gold. It stared at me, unmoving, as if it had been waiting. "You've come far," the creature said, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to echo through the spires. "Farther than most." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. "Why do you climb?" it asked. "To prove your worth? To escape your guilt? You climbed for the wrong reasons, Eric." "How do you know my name?" I whispered. The creature grinned, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "I know everything about you. I know what you've done, what you failed to do." I staggered back. "I didn't mean for him to die." "But he did. And now you seek absolution. Do you think reaching the top will erase your sins?" "I just wanted to—" My voice broke. "I don't know." The creature tilted its head. "Climb down now and you live, but if you stay—" Its grin widened. "You become part of this place." I wanted to run, to scramble back down the rock, but my body wouldn't move. The creature's eyes burned into me, filling my head with visions. Greg falling, screaming my name. The rock cutting into his hands as he lost his grip. My own helplessness as the rope snapped. "Stop!" I shouted. "Leave me alone!" The creature laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "The proud always fall." I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed. When I finally forced myself to move, the creature vanished, but the shadows seemed to follow me. I climbed down as fast as I could, nearly slipping more than once, until I reached the ground. When I got back to the RV, the air felt lighter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My hands shook as I started the engine and drove away. I haven't climbed since that day. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I see the spires in my dreams, and sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I swear I catch a glimpse of glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. The devil's teeth left its mark on me. Maybe it always will. My name is Megan Hart, and I'm 28 years old. This happened 2 years ago during an ill-fated camping trip to Larch Mountain, just outside Portland, Oregon. I'd gone with a group of friends, hoping to escape the monotony of my office job and reconnect with nature. Instead, I came face to face with something I can barely describe, something that still haunts my nights. Amber was the one who convinced me to go. She always had a way of pulling me into her spontaneous adventures. "Come on, Megan," she'd said, tossing her blonde curls over one shoulder. "You need to unplug. Fresh air, trees, maybe even a little danger. It'll be fun." I wasn't sure how Eli, her boyfriend, felt about being roped in. He'd grumbled through every trip Amber planned, but always gave in. Nate, the last member of our group, was quieter. I liked Nate. He had a thoughtful air about him, though his fascination with folklore and urban legends sometimes unnerved me. We set out for Larch Mountain in Amber's aging SUV. The plan was to hike an off-trail route Nate had researched and camp near the summit for the best views. It sounded good on paper, but the closer we got to the mountain, the more I felt an inexplicable weight in my chest. "You're gonna love this," Nate said from the back seat. "Larch Mountain's got history. The Multnomah tribe considered it sacred, but there are stories about spirits called the Silent Ones. Supposedly, they mimic voices to lure people away." "Sounds like a bad campfire tale," Amber scoffed, adjusting her sunglasses. "It's real," Nate insisted. "Hikers have gone missing here for decades." Amber laughed, but I caught Eli shaking his head. "Let's just get this over with," he muttered. The trail was harder than I expected. Nate's shortcut led us off the main path deeper into the dense, shadowed woods. The ground was uneven, littered with roots that snagged our boots and rocks that wobbled underfoot. Amber had packed light, bringing snacks and a cheap tent. Meanwhile, Eli's tent, which he'd picked up on sale, turned out to be little more than a glorified tarp. I carried my own gear, a sturdy backpack with enough food, water, and supplies to last me through the weekend. As the hours passed, tension mounted. Amber kept veering off course, insisting she knew a better way, while Eli grumbled about the weight of the unnecessary camping chairs she'd made him carry. When we finally stopped to set up camp, it was nearly dark. We found a clearing surrounded by towering firs and pitched our tents under a moonless sky. That was when I heard it, the first sign something wasn't right. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the branches, but as I crouched by the campfire warming my hands, I realized the sound had a rhythm to it. It was faint, like whispers just out of earshot. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Amber laughed, tossing another log onto the fire. "Hear what? The sound of you overthinking again?" But Nate's expression grew serious. "It's not nothing," he said quietly. "The forest can play tricks, but—" He didn't finish the sentence. That night, I barely slept. The whispers grew louder, as if circling the camp, but every time I peered out of the tent, there was nothing there. The next morning, things got worse. As we packed up to continue hiking, Nate noticed something strange. "Guys," he said, crouching by the fire pit, "look at this." In the dirt, overlapping our footprints, were tracks. They started as animal, deer, I think, but halfway through the clearing they morphed into something else. Human footprints, barefoot, leading into the woods. Amber rolled her eyes. Bigfoot, maybe? Eli frowned. It's weird, though. Why would they change like that? Nate stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. The silent ones, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They mimic people. Not just voices, but footsteps, movements. Okay, that's enough of the ghost stories, Amber snapped. Let's keep moving. The second day of hiking was harder. The trail disappeared entirely, leaving us to navigate with Nate's map and compass. We stumbled through dense brush, scratched by branches and soaked from an unexpected rain. Eli's tent leaked during the downpour, leaving him fuming and Amber apologetic. By late afternoon, we found a series of strange wooden totems hanging from the trees. They were crudely made from twigs, bound together with what looked like strands of human hair. Now, this is creepy, Amber admitted, snapping a photo on her phone. You shouldn't touch them, Nate warned. Why not? Amber asked, reaching out to flick one. They could be wards, or warnings, Nate said, his voice grave. We're in the middle of nowhere. You don't know who might have left these. Amber hesitated, but eventually shrugged it off. We pressed on, but the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the forest itself was watching. That night, everything fell apart. We set up camp in another clearing, surrounded by towering trees. The air was deathly still. As we ate dinner around the fire, Nate told more stories about the silent ones. They can take on the form of anyone, he said. A lost loved one, a friend, even you. Amber snorted. Okay, Nate, I think we get it. You want to freak us out. But I was already on edge. The whispers had returned, louder this time, and as the firelight flickered, I swore I saw movement in the shadows. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching leaves outside my tent. At first, I thought it was Amber or Eli, but then I heard my own voice, calling from the darkness. Megan, help me, please. My blood ran cold. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. There, just beyond the fire's dying embers, I saw myself, standing in the woods barefoot, with a twisted smile that didn't belong on my face. Megan, the voice repeated, warping into a guttural growl. I scrambled back, heart racing, and shut the tent. The whispers grew louder, joined by Amber's laughter and Eli's voice, all coming from different directions. By morning, Amber was gone. Her tent was empty, her boots still inside. We called her name, searching the woods, but there was no answer. Nate found her flashlight near one of the totems. Its lens cracked. Something's wrong, he said. We need to leave. Eli refused to leave without Amber. We can't just abandon her, he argued. She's gone, Nate said, and if we stay, we'll be next. As the argument escalated, I spotted movement in the distance. Amber was standing in the trees, her back turned to us. Amber, Eli shouted, running toward her. No, Nate grabbed his arm, stopping him. That's not her. Eli shook him off and kept running. By the time he reached her, she had disappeared. Only her laughter remained, echoing through the woods. We never saw Eli again. Nate and I ran, abandoning our gear and following the faint outline of the trail. The whispers surrounded us, growing louder, overlapping until they became an unbearable cacophony. At one point, I thought I saw Nate ahead of me, motioning for me to follow. But when I reached him, he was standing still, staring at something in the distance. They're here, he whispered. I turned and saw them, figures emerging from the shadows. They were human-shaped, but wrong. Limbs too long, faces twisted into grotesque imitations of ours. They moved without sound, gliding toward us. "Run," Nate said. I didn't need to be told twice. We made it back to the parking lot just as the sun rose. The forest was silent again, the whispers gone. Nate didn't say a word as we got into Amber's SUV and drove away. Days later, search teams combed the mountain but found no trace of Amber or Eli. Nate vanished soon after, leaving a cryptic note. "I have to know the truth." As for me, I haven't set foot in a forest since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear my own voice outside my window calling my name. I don't answer. My name is Ian Caldwell, and I'm 35 years old. 2 years ago, I made the mistake of camping alone at Cape Perpetua, a rugged stretch of Oregon's coastline known for its dramatic cliffs and the infamous Thor's Well. I went there to take photographs, hoping to capture the beauty of nature and maybe quiet the grief I'd been carrying since my wife, Sarah, died in a car accident. What I found instead was something I can hardly bring myself to believe, something that still haunts me to this day. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few scattered vehicles. My RV, a beat-up Class C I'd been traveling in for months, was a comforting cocoon against the world. Setting it up was second nature by now. Level it out, check the water tanks, and settle in for the night. The air at Cape Perpetua smelled like salt and pine. Waves crashed against the cliffs below, and gulls called overhead. It was everything I needed. Solitude, quiet, and a chance to focus on my photography. My plan was simple: spend a few days photographing Thor's Well, a natural sinkhole where the ocean poured into the earth like a drain, and maybe hike some of the trails nearby. After setting up camp, I noticed an older woman sitting by a weathered van a few spots down. She was in her 50s, with streaks of gray in her frizzy hair and a peculiar intensity in her dark eyes. She waved me over. "You here alone?" she asked as I approached. Her voice had a slight rasp, like she'd spent years smoking. I nodded. "Yeah, just here to take some photos." "You're brave," she said with a strange smile. "Or stupid. You know about the Watcher, don't you?" "The what?" I asked, confused. "The Watcher," she repeated, lowering her voice. "The one who watches from the cliffs. People disappear out here, you know. It doesn't like cameras." She leaned closer. "You should leave." I forced a polite laugh, assuming she was messing with me. "I think I'll be fine. Thanks for the warning, though." She just shook her head. "Suit yourself." The first day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon scouting locations for the best shots of Thor's Well. The cliffs were stunning, with jagged rocks jutting out into the churning ocean below. Thor's Well itself was mesmerizing, a black hole swallowing the sea. I took a few test shots, pleased with the composition. That night, back at the RV, I heard strange noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind. Cape Perpetua was notorious for sudden gusts, but then it changed. Low groans carried through the air, almost like the sound of something large shifting on the cliffs. I dismissed it as my imagination, but it was enough to keep me tossing and turning. The next morning, I noticed something odd. My camera had malfunctioned. The images I'd taken the previous day were corrupted, strange distortions rippling across the frames. In some of them, I could swear there was a shadow, something tall and humanoid, just beyond the edges of the shot. Shaking it off as a technical glitch, I returned to Thor's Well that afternoon. The weather had shifted, with heavy clouds rolling in and the sharp wind cutting through my jacket. I set up my tripod near the edge of the cliff, adjusting the settings to capture the dramatic waves crashing into the sinkhole. That's when I saw it. A figure stood on the opposite cliff, motionless against the gray sky. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but something about it was wrong. It was too tall, its limbs too long, and its posture unnaturally rigid. I raised my camera to zoom in, but when I looked through the lens, the figure was gone. I scanned the area, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. That evening, I ran into another camper, a gruff man in his 60s who introduced himself as Dean. He was sitting by his truck, cleaning a rifle. "You camping near Thor's Well?" he asked, his tone wary. I nodded. "Yeah, why?" He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "Don't go near the cliffs after dark, and don't take pictures out there." "Why not?" "Things happen out here," he said, his voice low. "Bad things." "Like what?" Dean just shook his head. "You don't want to know." That night, the noises returned, louder this time. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling as the RV creaked under the force of the wind. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind whistling through the trees, but the sounds were too deliberate, too human. It was faint, almost like my name being called. Ian. Ian. I sat up, my heart racing. "Hello," I called, though I immediately regretted it. My voice sounded absurdly loud in the quiet RV. No answer. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside. The night was eerily still. The wind gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. I scanned the campsite, my beam cutting through the dark. That's when I saw the footprints. They circled my RV, large and barefoot, leading off toward the cliffs. My stomach twisted. I hurried back inside, locking the door and pulling the blinds shut. The next morning, I found Jackie sitting by her van, staring out at the ocean. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, without looking at me. "Saw what?" I said, though my voice betrayed me. "The Watcher," she said, finally turning to face me. "It shows itself when it wants something. Don't give it a reason to take you." I didn't respond. Instead, I packed my gear and headed back to Thor's Well, determined to prove to myself that there was a rational explanation for everything. Maybe the footprints were just from another camper. Maybe the figure on the cliff was a trick of the light. But as I reached the cliffs, the feeling of unease returned. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive weight you feel before a storm. I set up my camera, focusing on the sinkhole, and tried to ignore the sensation of being watched. Then it appeared again. The figure stood at the edge of the well, its glowing eyes fixed on me. This time, I couldn't convince myself it was a trick of the light. It was real, and it was watching me. Slowly, it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed at me. I don't remember running back to the RV, but I must have. I locked the door, my chest heaving, and stared out the window. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but I knew it was still out there. That night, the dreams came. I saw Sarah, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Leave, Ian," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It doesn't want you here." When I woke, my RV was surrounded by footprints again. Larger this time, and they didn't stop at the door. They circled the vehicle over and over, like whatever had made them had been waiting for me to come out. By dawn, I'd had enough. I packed up, leaving behind my tripod and some of my gear in my haste to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The Watcher stood at the edge of the campsite, its glowing eyes fixed on me, but it didn't follow. It just stood there, watching, as I disappeared down the road. I don't go camping anymore. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear whispers, faint and distant, like my name being carried on the wind. I try to ignore them, but deep down, I know the Watcher hasn't let me go, and it's still out there, waiting for the next person who dares to look too closely. My name is Rachel Stevens. I'm 40 years old, a geologist, and 2 years ago, I made a mistake I'll never forget. I was camping alone in Ochoco National Forest in eastern Oregon, documenting rare geological formations for a book I was writing. It was supposed to be just another solo trip, quiet, peaceful, and productive. Instead, I left with scars I can't explain and memories that still make me question what's real. The drive to Walton Lake was uneventful. My RV hummed along the narrow road, the forest thickening around me the closer I got to the campground. I remember thinking how perfect the scenery was. Towering pines, sunlight filtering through the leaves, the distant sound of birdsong. It felt like a place untouched by time, isolated from the chaos of the world. When I arrived, the campsite was almost empty. Just one sleek, modern RV parked a few spots away, and a weathered cabin hidden back among the trees. The sense of solitude should have been comforting, but instead I felt a faint unease I couldn't quite place. I shook it off and parked my RV, setting up camp quickly. I had a schedule to keep. Photograph the unique basalt formations near a hidden ravine Nate, a colleague, had told me about. He'd warned me the terrain was rugged and the location a bit off the beaten path, but that was exactly what I loved. I was organizing my gear when I noticed the couple from the other RV approaching. They were middle-aged, maybe in their late 50s, and both wore broad, friendly smiles. The woman waved enthusiastically as they got closer. "Hi there, I'm Marcy, and this is Will," she said, gesturing to her husband. "We saw your RV and thought we'd say hello. You don't get many people out here this time of year." "Rachel," I replied, shaking their hands. They seemed pleasant enough, and I appreciated the company, even if just for a moment. "Birdwatchers?" I guessed, noticing Marcy's binoculars. Marcy nodded. "That's right. The forest here is amazing. So much life if you know where to look." Her tone shifted slightly, almost conspiratorial. "But be careful if you're wandering. These woods can be tricky." "What do you mean?" I asked, intrigued. Will cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "There's a ravine not far from here. Locals call it the Hollow. It's beautiful, but people say strange things happen there." I laughed nervously. "Let me guess. Haunted?" Marcy grinned, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Something like that." I didn't think much of their warning at the time. The next morning, I set out early, armed with my camera, GPS, and a map I'd marked up with Nate's directions. The hike was challenging. Steep inclines, loose rocks, but the forest was stunning. Sunlight dappled the ground, and the air smelled of pine and earth. It was exactly what I needed. But as I got closer to the ravine, the atmosphere began to change. The air felt heavier, cooler, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. My GPS started glitching, its signal wavering despite the clear sky above. Even my compass spun aimlessly, its needle refusing to settle. I told myself it was just interference, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed too tall, their shadows stretching unnaturally long, and the silence was oppressive. No birds, no rustling leaves, just me and the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. When I finally reached the ravine, I froze. The hollow was a steep, jagged cut in the earth, its walls lined with moss and twisted roots. At its base lay a scattering of bones, some animal, some not. My stomach turned, but curiosity pushed me forward. I snapped photos, documenting the strange rock formations and the eerie carvings etched into the stone. They looked ancient, depicting figures with elongated limbs and antlers. Then I saw it. A boulder at the edge of the hollow was covered in moss and lichen, its surface strangely smooth. As I raised my camera to photograph it, the viewfinder showed something I hadn't noticed with my own eyes. A humanoid figure, its body cloaked in bark and moss, standing motionless at the edge of the ravine. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the shadows. I lowered the camera, my heart pounding. The figure was gone. I practically ran back to camp, my chest tight with panic. When I arrived, Marcy and Will were sitting by their RV, chatting like nothing was wrong. "Did you find it?" Marcy asked, her voice light but her eyes sharp. "The hollow?" I said, my voice trembling. "Yeah, I found it. And something else." Marcy exchanged a glance with Will, who sighed heavily. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said. "The Guardian doesn't like to be disturbed." "What are you talking about?" I demanded. "What Guardian?" Marcy stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The forest protects itself. People think they can take from it without consequence, but the Guardian remembers. You're lucky you got out." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't believe in folklore or curses, but what I'd seen at the Hollow defied explanation. I decided, then and there, to leave the next morning. That night, I locked the RV door and pulled the blind shut, but sleep wouldn't come. Around midnight I heard it, heavy footsteps circling the RV, deliberate and unhurried. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped near the door, followed by a low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. I didn't move, didn't dare look. After what felt like hours, the sound faded, leaving only silence. In the morning, I found claw marks raked across the RV's door. My stomach twisted as I noticed a trail of large, barefoot prints leading back toward the hollow. I packed up quickly, desperate to leave, but when I tried to drive away, the RV wouldn't budge. The tires were sunk into the soft earth, almost as if the ground itself had swallowed them. I cursed and grabbed a shovel, but no matter how much I dug, the tires remained stuck. Marcy and Will appeared again, watching me with unsettling calm. "You can't leave until it lets you," Marcy said softly. "Until what lets me?" I snapped, panic rising in my chest. Will pointed toward the forest. "You've angered the Guardian. It wants something from you." Desperate for answers, I followed the trail back to the hollow, clutching a flashlight and my camera like talismans. The forest seemed darker, the trees closer, as though they were leaning in to watch me. When I reached the ravine, the Guardian was waiting. It rose from the mossy boulder like a shadow come to life, its body impossibly tall and thin, its eyes burning with an ancient, unnatural light. It didn't speak, but images flooded my mind. Visions of forest destroyed, wildlife displaced, and the jagged pain of loss. I saw my husband's face, the guilt I'd carried since his death. The Guardian wasn't just showing me its rage, it was showing me mine. "What do you want?" I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The answer came in a single clear thought. An offering. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wedding ring, the one thing I'd clung to since my husband's death. It felt like a betrayal to let it go, but deep down, I knew it was time. With trembling hands, I placed the ring on the moss-covered boulder and stepped back. The Guardian tilted its head, its glowing eyes flickering. Slowly, it sank into the earth, its form dissolving into the moss and roots. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting as the forest seemed to exhale. When I returned to camp, the RV was free. I left Ochoko Forest that day, and I've never gone back. I finished my book, but I left the hollow out of it. Some stories aren't meant to be told. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel the Guardian's eyes on me. And sometimes I think it wasn't just the forest it was protecting me from myself. My name is Kate Sanders, and I'm 28 years old. What happened to me in Hell's Canyon last October changed my life forever. I don't tell this story often, not because I've forgotten it, but because there are parts of it that still make me wake up screaming. Maybe putting it down in words will help me make sense of it. Maybe not, but you need to hear it. It started as a reunion. My brother Tom, our childhood friend Dana, and a guy I worked with named Lucas decided to take a trip into Hell's Canyon. I'd planned it to be a bonding experience. Hiking, camping, fishing. Nothing complicated, just some quality time together. Tom was 30, the laid-back type, always cracking jokes and shrugging off responsibility. Dana, 29, was sharp-tongued and full of fire. Lucas, 32, was the survivalist of the group. A little intense, but he knew the outdoors like the back of his hand. Me? I was the planner, the one who'd picked Hell's Canyon because I thought the isolation would bring us closer. I had no idea how much that isolation would cost us. We drove out to the canyon on a cool October morning, the RV rattling over rough mountain roads. The landscape was rugged and dramatic, sheer cliffs, deep gorges, and the wild Snake River cutting through it all. The place had a beauty that felt untouched, ancient. We stopped at a small gas station before reaching the trailhead, and that's where we met him. He was an old man with weathered skin and eyes that seemed too alert for his age. He was sitting on the porch, sipping coffee, when he saw us unload. "You headed into the canyon?" he asked, his voice like gravel. "Yeah," Tom said, grinning. "Any tips?" The old man didn't smile back. "Yeah, don't." Dana rolled her eyes, but I stepped forward. "What do you mean?" "People go missing out there," he said. "Some don't come back. The old ones, they like the dark places, hungry spirits. Cannibals, some say. Call them what you want, but they don't take kindly to strangers." Lucas snorted. "We'll be fine. We're prepared." The old man didn't argue, but he held my gaze a little too long before turning back to his coffee. We reached the trailhead a couple of hours later and set up camp near the river. It wasn't the most level spot, but it was picturesque. The river shimmered under the fading light, and the sound of rushing water was soothing. The first sign that something was off came that night. We'd just finished dinner when Dana pointed to the far side of the river. "Do you see that?" she asked. Across the water, in the shadows of the trees, something moved. A shape, tall, thin, and jerky in its movements, slipped between the trees. It was too far to see clearly, but it didn't look right. It didn't look human. "It's probably just a deer," Tom said, dismissing it. But I wasn't so sure. The next day, things started to go wrong. Tom realized his tent had a rip in it, and the extra lanterns he'd packed had dead batteries. Dana and Lucas bickered constantly, about the route, about how much water to carry, about everything. The tension was palpable, and it only got worse as we climbed deeper into the canyon. That afternoon we found something that made my stomach turn. A deer carcass, its body torn open, lay sprawled across the trail. The flesh had been stripped from the bones in some places, claw marks gouged deep into its hide. Lucas knelt by it, examining the wounds. "These aren't from a bear," he said quietly. "Too clean." That night, the sounds started. At first, it was just the wind, but then came the screams, high-pitched and inhuman, echoing through the gorge. "What the hell is that?" Dana whispered, clutching her flashlight. None of us answered. We just sat by the fire, listening as the screams faded into an eerie silence. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of movement outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. "Kate." It was Tom's voice, soft and urgent, just outside the tent. "Kate, Come out here. I need you." I unzipped the tent slowly, but when I stepped outside, Tom wasn't there. The campsite was empty, the fire reduced to embers. "Tom," I called. No answer. The next morning, Tom swore he hadn't left his tent all night. I wanted to believe him, but something about the way he avoided my eyes made me uneasy. By the third day, we were falling apart. Lucas insisted we stick together, but Tom kept wandering off, claiming he saw something in the distance. Dana was jumpy and irritable, snapping at anyone who spoke to her. I felt like I was losing my grip, constantly looking over my shoulder. And then we saw it. We were hiking along a ridge when Dana froze, pointing ahead. "There," she whispered. It was standing on the trail, maybe 50 feet away. Tall, emaciated, with skin that looked stretched too tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth hung open, revealing jagged teeth. "What is that?" Dana hissed. The creature tilted its head, studying us. Then it moved, fast, unnaturally fast, disappearing into the trees. We didn't wait to find out where it had gone. We ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, until we reached a clearing. "What the hell was that thing?" Tom panted. "Wendigo," Lucas said grimly. "I think that's what the old man was talking about. They're drawn to fear, to division." "That's just a story," Dana said, though her voice wavered. "Does that look like a story to you?" Lucas shot back. That night, the Wendigo attacked. It came out of the dark, screeching like a banshee. Tom had wandered too far from the fire, and by the time we realized he was gone, it was too late. We heard him scream, once short and sharp, before the sound cut off. We found his body the next morning, torn and mangled, his eyes wide with terror. Dana broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Lucas was pale and silent, his hands trembling as he packed up our gear. "We have to leave," he said. "Now." The hike out was a nightmare. The Wendigo followed us, its glowing eyes appearing in the shadows, its voice mimicking Tom's to lure us off the trail. "Help me," it whispered, sounding just like him. Dana was the first to break. She ran toward the voice, and before we could stop her, she was gone. Lucas and I searched for hours, but we never found her. By the time we reached the RV, we were exhausted, starving, and barely holding it together. But the moment we crossed the canyon's edge, the voices stopped. The air felt lighter, less oppressive. Lucas drove while I sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly at the road. I couldn't stop thinking about Tom, about Dana, about the thing that had stalked us through the canyon. As we pulled into my driveway, Lucas turned to me. "Do you think it's over?" I didn't know how to answer. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. "Kate." Tom's voice, soft and urgent, coming from outside my window. I didn't look, and I never went back to Hell's Canyon. My name is Eleanor Barnes, but most people call me Ellie. I'm 35 years old, recently divorced, and on the day this story begins, I was trying to prove to myself that I didn't need anyone. It was late October, and I'd parked my small RV at Silver Falls State Park in Oregon for what I hoped would be a peaceful, solo getaway. I've always found comfort in the outdoors, and I thought the isolation would help me get my head straight. I couldn't have been more wrong. The trip started like any other. I arrived at Silver Falls in the early afternoon, checking in with the park ranger at the entrance. She was an older woman with graying hair tucked under a hat, and her name tag read June. She glanced at my map and frowned when I told her I was planning to camp near the North Falls Trail. "You're better off staying closer to the main loop," she said, handing me back the map. "The North Falls area gets strange." Strange how? I asked, genuinely curious. June hesitated, as though weighing whether she should say anything. Just stay close to the main trails, she said finally, her tone curt. It's safer. I shrugged it off. I've camped alone before, and strange warnings are part of the experience. But I'll admit, the way June looked at me as I pulled away from the station made my stomach tighten. The North Falls Trail was gorgeous. Towering trees, moss-covered rocks, and the sound of cascading water everywhere. It felt like stepping into a fairy tale. I parked my RV in a small secluded clearing near the trailhead and set up my little camp. By the time the sun began to dip below the trees, I was sitting by a fire with a cup of instant coffee, feeling proud of myself for taking this trip. The first sign that something was off came the next morning. I was hiking along the trail, following the river to the base of the falls, when I spotted something sticking out of the mud. It was a small, rusted iron pendant, shaped like a crescent moon. It looked handmade, and despite the rust, there was something oddly beautiful about it. When I picked it up, I felt a strange chill, as though the air around me had suddenly dropped several degrees. I told myself it was just the cold metal against my skin, but my hand didn't stop shaking until I shoved the pendant into my pocket and started walking again. By the time I got back to my RV, the sky had clouded over. The weather forecast had promised clear skies, but a dense fog was rolling in fast, swallowing the trees. The wind picked up too, sharp and biting, and the firewood I'd collected earlier refused to light. That night, I sat alone in the dark, listening to the wind howl and trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease that had settled over me. The first whispers came that night. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when I heard them, a faint, breathy voice just outside the RV. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I strained to listen, I realized the voice was speaking. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a woman, her tone low and angry. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, heart pounding. The fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead, and the trees loomed like shadowy giants. "Hello!" I called, my voice shaking. The whispering stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I backed into the RV and locked the door, my hands trembling. I didn't sleep much that night, and when morning came, I told myself it was just my imagination. I'd been alone too long, that was all. But things got worse. The next day, my RV's electrical system started acting up. The lights flickered, my GPS refused to work, and my phone battery drained inexplicably fast. I tried to brush it off as bad luck, but the whispers returned that night, louder this time. They didn't stay outside either. I heard them inside the RV, coming from the corners of the room, from under the bed, from everywhere. "Give it back," they said, over and over. "Give it back." I clutched the pendant in my hand, realizing for the first time that I'd made a terrible mistake. I should have left it where I'd found it. The next morning, I decided to return the pendant to the trail, hoping it would stop whatever was happening. But the trail didn't look the same. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth thicker. It felt like the forest itself was conspiring against me, twisting the path to keep me from reaching the falls. I felt it watching me too. A shadow flitted through the trees just out of sight. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, but then I saw it clearly. A figure, tall and skeletal, wrapped in tattered black fabric. Its face was pale and hollow, with eyes like burning coals. It didn't move toward me, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, watching. I turned and ran. That night, the witch came to my campsite. I was sitting in the RV, the doors locked and the curtains drawn, when the whispering started again. It grew louder and louder, until it wasn't whispering anymore, but screaming. The windows rattled, and the temperature inside the RV plummeted. Then I saw her, standing just outside the window. Her face was a nightmare. Hollow eyes, skin stretched tight over bone, her mouth twisted into a jagged grin. Her hair clung to her head in wet, stringy clumps, and water dripped from her tattered dress. "Give it back," she hissed, her voice like nails scraping against glass. I clutched the pendant, terrified. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'll put it back." "I swear." The witch tilted her head, her grin widening. "Too late," she said. The windows shattered. The force knocked me backward, and when I scrambled to my feet, the witch was gone. But the whispers were still there, circling me like a storm. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I grabbed the pendant, stuffed it into my pocket, and set off toward the falls. The trail was worse than ever. Trees bent low as if reaching for me, their branches clawing at my clothes. The fog was so thick I could barely see my feet, and every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw her shadow. By the time I reached the falls, I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. The water roared, drowning out the whispers, but I could feel her presence all around me. I pulled the pendant from my pocket and placed it on a mossy rock near the water's edge. "I'm sorry," I said again, my voice breaking. "Please, let me go." The wind howled, and the ground beneath me trembled. The fog swirled violently, and for a moment, I thought I saw her face in the mist, her hollow eyes staring at me. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. The fog lifted, and the forest felt lighter. I ran back to the RV, not daring to look back. I left Silver Falls that same day, vowing never to return. But the witch isn't gone. I know that now. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the whispers again, faint but unmistakable. And when I look out my window, I swear I see her shadow in the distance, waiting for me to come back. My name is Jake Hartman, and I'm 40 years old. I used to be a firefighter, until the fire that ended my career and left me with scars that run deeper than skin. A few months ago, my therapist suggested I get out of the city and try reconnecting with nature. So I packed up my old RV and headed for Tillamook State Forest in Oregon. I thought I'd find peace there, maybe even a way to forgive myself for what happened that night. Instead, I found something I can't explain. I arrived at Tillamook on a crisp October morning, the kind where the sunlight filters through the trees in golden beams. The forest was quiet, except for the sound of the Wilson River rushing somewhere in the distance. It felt like the perfect place to clear my head, and when I pulled into a small campground off a dirt road, I was relieved to see I had the place to myself. As I set up camp, though, something felt off. The air was too still, and the silence wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to nerves. After all, it was my first solo trip, and I was out here to prove to myself I could handle being alone. The first day went smoothly enough. I hiked a stretch of the Wilson River Trail, fished for a while, and spent the evening by a campfire with a book and a thermos of coffee. By the time I crawled into bed, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. Then I heard it. It was a clicking noise, faint at first, like the sound of a stick tapping against a tree. I sat up in bed listening. It came from just outside the RV, deliberate and steady. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, shining the beam into the trees. "Hello," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as I was about to head back inside, I caught a glimpse of something, pale and thin, moving quickly between the trees. "Who's there?" I shouted, stepping down from the RV. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. The forest didn't answer. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a deer moving through the trees. But when I went to fetch my fishing rod from the back of the RV, I found scratches along the side of the vehicle. Long, thin marks, like claw scratches. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They hadn't been there the day before. I spent the morning on the trail, hoping to shake the unease that had settled over me. But the forest felt different now. The trees seemed closer together, their shadows darker. Every so often, I'd hear that clicking noise again, faint and distant, but never far enough to ease my nerves. Then I saw her. She was sitting on a rock by the river, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked young, early 20s maybe, with dirty clothes and tangled hair. When she saw me, her eyes widened, and she scrambled to her feet. "Are you okay?" I asked, keeping my distance. She shook her head, her voice trembling. "I've been lost for days." I offered her some water and asked how she'd ended up here. She told me her name was Mallory and that she'd come to the forest for a short day hike. But when she tried to leave, the trails didn't make sense anymore. They kept looping back on themselves, like the forest was trying to trap her. At first, I thought she was just scared and disoriented. But when she mentioned the clicking noises, my blood ran cold. "They're out there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The silent ones. I think they're watching us." I brought Mallory back to the RV, figuring we could regroup and try to find our way out together. She seemed calmer, with a roof over her head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling me everything. That night, the clicking returned. This time, it was louder, closer. It circled the RV, moving from one side to the other, as if whatever was making it was testing the boundaries of our little sanctuary. Mallory sat on the bed, her knees pulled to her chest, whispering to herself. I couldn't make out the words, but her voice sounded almost like a prayer. "Stay inside," I told her, grabbing the flashlight and stepping out into the cold. The forest was alive with sound now, clicking and rustling, coming from every direction. I turned in circles, the flashlight trembling in my hand, until I saw them. They were tall, impossibly thin figures, their pale skin glowing faintly in the moonlight. Their faces were smooth, featureless, like mannequins, and their limbs moved in strange, jerky motions. They stood at the edge of the clearing, dozens of them, clicking in perfect unison. I stumbled back, slamming the RV door shut. "We're leaving," I told Mallory, grabbing the keys. She didn't argue. We drove through the night, the RV bouncing along the dirt road as I tried to put as much distance between us and the clearing as possible. But no matter how far I drove, the forest didn't change. The same trees, the same bends in the road. It was like we were going in circles. "They won't let us leave," Mallory said, her voice hollow. "Why not?" I demanded. She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "Because I took something." "What?" She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small carved wooden figurine. It was crude and simple, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. "I found it near the river," she said. "I thought it was just a souvenir. I didn't know it belonged to them." My stomach churned. "You need to put it back." We returned to the river at dawn, the silent ones following us at a distance. They didn't attack, but their presence was suffocating, their clicking a constant reminder that they were waiting. Mallory placed the figurine on a rock by the water, her hands shaking. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the forest went silent. The silent ones disappeared, melting into the shadows like smoke. Mallory turned to me, her face pale. "You need to go, now." "What about you?" She shook her head. "I don't think I can leave." Before I could argue, the ground beneath me shifted, and I was back at my campsite alone. The RV was parked exactly where I'd left it, as if the last 24 hours had been nothing but a dream. But it wasn't. The scratches on the RV were still there. And when I looked into the trees, I saw a single figure standing in the shadows, watching me. I drove out of Tillamook that day and never looked back. But even now, I hear the clicking sometimes, faint and distant. And I know they're still watching. My name is Emma Hayes, and I'm 24 years old. I've always been a rational person, the kind who prefers logic over superstition. What happened to me last summer in the forests of Mount Hood still doesn't feel real, but it happened, and I'm finally ready to tell my story. This started as a simple camping trip, a chance to reconnect with my friends before life pulled us in different directions. Derek, our ringleader, had suggested Lost Lake in Mount Hood National Forest. "It's beautiful, it's remote, and we'll have the whole place to ourselves," he'd said. His enthusiasm was infectious, and despite my reservations, I agreed. So did Sophia and Jake, our other two friends. Derek and I had been at odds for years, but our mutual friend Jake was the glue that held our group together. Sophia was my roommate, and while she wasn't much for camping, she loved a good thrill. Together, we packed into Derek's beat-up RV and headed into the wilderness. The drive to Lost Lake was uneventful, though the narrow roads winding through the dense forest put me on edge. The RV rattled with every bump, and Sophia joked that it might fall apart before we got there. Derek, as usual, brushed off her concerns. When we finally arrived, the lake was breathtaking. The water mirrored the towering trees and snow-capped peaks, and the air smelled clean and crisp. It felt like the perfect escape. Derek parked the RV in a small clearing near the lake's edge, and we set up a modest campfire. I tried to push aside my unease as we settled in, but something about the forest felt off. The silence was too complete, as if the trees were holding their breath. But Derek's carefree laughter and Sophia's sarcastic banter made it easier to ignore. That first night, things started to go wrong. After dinner, we sat around the campfire, swapping stories. Derek told a half-baked urban legend about hikers disappearing in these woods, but Sophia and Jake dismissed it as nonsense. I stayed quiet, feeling the weight of the dark forest pressing in on us. Around midnight, the fire was dying down when we heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps circling our camp. Jake tensed. "Probably an animal," Derek said, though his voice lacked conviction. The footsteps stopped, and we all exchanged uneasy glances. Then, from the darkness, came a whistle. Not a bird or the wind, but a clear human whistle. 3 notes, slow and deliberate. "Someone's messing with us," Sophia said, though she didn't sound convinced. We stayed awake, jumpy and silent, until the sky began to lighten. The footsteps didn't return, but the forest felt different, watchful. The next morning, we found Derek's boots missing from where he'd left them outside the RV. "Probably a raccoon," he said with a shrug, but we all knew raccoons didn't carry boots away. The day was supposed to be about hiking and enjoying the scenery, but tensions were high. Jake was unusually quiet, and Sophia was glued to her phone, searching for a signal. I decided to explore the area, armed with a map I'd insisted on bringing. Derek scoffed at it, of course, but I didn't care. As we hiked along a poorly marked trail, I noticed something odd. The forest floor was crisscrossed with tracks. Deer, by the looks of them, but alongside the hooves were human footprints, bare and impossibly large. I pointed them out to Derek, but he laughed it off. "Probably some hippie walking around barefoot," he said. I wasn't convinced. The prints were too deep, as if whatever had made them weighed far more than a person should. That night, the forest came alive with sounds. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, and that same eerie whistle from the night before. It seemed to move closer, circling our camp. Derek tried to act brave, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Then, around 2 a.m., we heard it. Jake's name, called in my voice. "Jake?" The voice was soft, pleading, and coming from the woods. Jake froze, staring at me. "Emma, was that you?" he whispered. "Of course not," I said, my heart pounding. The voice called again, this time more urgent. Jake moved toward the door of the RV, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there," I said. "It's not me." We sat in silence, listening as the voice grew fainter, disappearing into the forest. No one slept after that. The next morning, we decided to pack up and leave, but Derek insisted on one last hike to look for his boots. Against my better judgment, we followed him. We didn't find his boots. Instead, we stumbled upon a strange clearing. In the center was a crude shrine made of animal bones and antlers, arranged in a circle. A sickly sweet smell hung in the air, and flies buzzed around the remains of what looked like a deer. Sophia gagged, and Jake turned pale. "We should go," I said, but Derek lingered, poking at the bones with a stick. "This is some serious Blair Witch stuff," he said, grinning like an idiot. I yanked him away, and we hurried back to the RV. The forest felt suffocating. The trees too close, the shadows too long. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, it happened. We were sitting in the RV, trying to decide whether to leave immediately or wait until morning. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Derek grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, but no one was there. He stepped outside, shining the beam into the trees. "Probably just some—" His words cut off as he froze, the light trembling in his hand. We all crowded behind him and saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the flashlight. It looked like Derek, same height, same build, but its movements were jerky and unnatural. Its face was wrong. The features twisted and shifted, as if trying to decide what it wanted to be. "Get inside!" I screamed, dragging Derek back into the RV. The figure let out a sound, a guttural screech that made my blood run cold. It circled the RV for hours, tapping on the windows, whispering our names in voices that weren't quite right. Jake broke down, sobbing, while Sophia clutched a kitchen knife. Derek and I tried to come up with a plan, but nothing made sense. How do you fight something like that? As dawn approached, the whispers stopped. I remembered reading somewhere that skinwalkers hated being exposed. Desperate, we gathered what little dry wood we had left and started a fire just outside the RV. Then Derek did something reckless. He sliced his palm with a knife and walked to the shrine, dripping blood onto the bones. "Take this and leave us alone," he shouted into the forest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the forest erupted with sound. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, a deafening roar. The figure appeared again, but this time it stayed at the edge of the clearing, watching as we piled into the RV. The engine sputtered but finally roared to life. We drove until the forest gave way to open road, not daring to look back. We made it out, but not unscathed. Jake hasn't been the same since. He barely speaks and refuses to leave his apartment. Sophia moved to the city and won't even talk about the trip. Derek and I stay in touch, but there's a distance between us now. A shared trauma we can't escape. As for me, I still hear the whistle sometimes. 3 slow notes carried on the wind. And every so often I catch a glimpse of something in the shadows. Something that looks just a little too familiar. I don't know what it wants, but I'm afraid it's not done with us yet. My name is Clara Evans. I'm 33 years old. and I make my living as a freelance writer. It's a job I love, or at least I used to, until a string of failed projects left me questioning if I was any good at it. Last summer, feeling completely stuck and desperate for inspiration, I decided to take a solo trip to Silver Falls State Park in Oregon. It was supposed to be a chance to recharge, to clear my head, and maybe find the spark I'd lost. I never expected it to become the most terrifying experience of my life. The trip started uneventfully. I rented an old RV and stocked it with the essentials: canned food, a good flashlight, notebooks, and my laptop. The plan was to park near South Falls, one of the most famous spots in the park, and spend a few days hiking, writing, and trying to reconnect with the creativity I thought I'd lost. I arrived late in the afternoon. The parking area near the falls was quiet, with only a few other cars scattered around. The thick canopy of trees above made it feel cooler than it actually was, and the constant sound of the rushing waterfall in the distance was both soothing and overwhelming. I found a small, secluded clearing to park the RV and set up camp. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest around me grew darker than I'd expected. I lit a few candles inside the RV and settled in with a notebook, scribbling down half-formed ideas for a story I'd been struggling to write. But my thoughts kept wandering, distracted by the unfamiliar sounds of the forest: rustling leaves, distant animal calls, and a faint, high-pitched noise that almost sounded like crying. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or my imagination, but as the night went on, the sound became more distinct: a soft, mournful crying, like a child lost in the woods. My heart tightened. I told myself it was probably another camper's kid, but the sound seemed too close, too clear. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped on a jacket, and stepped outside. The air was cool and damp, and the forest loomed around me, dark and impenetrable. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The crying stopped. I shone the flashlight around the campsite, its beam bouncing off the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sound but the waterfall in the distance. I stayed outside for a few minutes, scanning the area before finally retreating to the RV. The crying didn't start again, but I barely slept that night, lying awake and listening to every creak and rustle around me. The next morning, I stepped outside and froze. The ground around the RV, still wet from the night's dew, was crisscrossed with footprints. Small, barefoot prints that couldn't have been made by an adult. They led from the edge of the clearing toward the falls, stopping abruptly at the water's edge. My stomach twisted. Maybe a child had wandered through during the night, but why would they be barefoot? And where had they gone? I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just a weird coincidence, but the thought lingered. I decided to go for a hike, hoping the exercise would clear my head. The trails around Silver Falls were beautiful, with lush greenery and the constant sound of water. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then I'd stop and glance over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone following me. But the trail was always empty. By late afternoon, the sky darkened, and a light drizzle began to fall. I hurried back to the RV, hoping to avoid getting caught in a storm. The rain intensified as night fell, drumming against the roof and windows. I tried to write, but the words wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying the events of the night before, the crying, the footprints. And then I heard it again. Faint at first, just barely audible over the rain. A child's voice calling out, "Help me!" I froze, my pen hovering above the page. The voice came again, clearer this time and closer. "Help me, please!" I grabbed the flashlight and hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, but what if it really was a child in danger? I opened the door and stepped into the rain, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" I called. "Where are you?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing near the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the rain. It looked like a young girl, her blonde curls matted to her head, her dress soaked and clinging to her small frame. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. But the girl didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me. The rain blurred my vision, and I wiped my face, trying to get a better look. When I turned back, she was gone. The next day, I decided to report what I'd seen to the park ranger station. I found Henry Thompson, an older man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. When I told him about the girl, his expression darkened. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low. "Don't stay near the falls after dark." "Why?" I pressed, but he wouldn't answer. Instead, he told me a story about a group of children from a nearby orphanage who drowned at the falls decades ago during a flash flood. "Some folks say their spirits never left," he added, his tone grim. I didn't know what to believe, but his words stayed with me as I returned to my campsite. That evening, while walking near the falls, I stumbled upon something strange. A small makeshift shrine made of sticks, stones, and what looked like fragments of bone. It was nestled in a hollow near the water, and the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. As I stood there, the air seemed to grow colder, and a soft whisper drifted through the trees. My name. That night, the storm returned, fiercer than before. I locked myself in the RV, trying to convince myself that the whispers and footprints were just my imagination. But then the knocking started. 3 sharp knocks on the door. I didn't answer. My heart pounded as the knocks came again, followed by a soft voice. "Clara, help me." I peeked through the window and saw the girl again, standing in the rain, her dress torn and muddy. But something was wrong. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, and her eyes were empty, black voids that seemed to swallow the light. The RV lights flickered, and the girl's face twisted into a hideous grin. I screamed, scrambling to grab my keys. The RV wouldn't start. The lights went out completely, and I was plunged into darkness. Desperate, I remembered what Henry had said about the children's spirits and how they were drawn to sentimental objects. I grabbed the only thing I had that mattered, a silver necklace that had belonged to my late mother. My hands trembled as I opened the door and stepped outside. The girl was gone, but the whispers surrounded me, growing louder and more insistent. I ran to the shrine and placed the necklace on top, shouting into the storm, "Take it. Just leave me alone." The whispers stopped. The air grew still, and the storm began to subside. For a moment, everything was silent. I left Silver Falls the next morning, driving away as fast as the RV would take me. The necklace was gone, and so were the whispers, but the experience left me shaken. Since that night, I haven't been able to visit another waterfall. The sound of rushing water makes my skin crawl, and sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of children laughing. I don't know what they wanted, and I hope I never find out. But one thing is certain, some places should be left alone. My name is Marcus Dunn, and I'm 41 years old. For most of my life, I've lived by one simple rule: keep moving forward. It's a lesson I learned in the Marines, and it's one that's kept me alive through situations that would break most people. But last summer, deep in the wilderness of Devil's Staircase, I learned that some things are impossible to escape. The trip was supposed to help me heal. I'd been struggling with grief ever since my younger brother, Eric, passed away 2 years ago. We were close. He'd looked up to me, relied on me, and I let him down. I thought getting away from the world, from people, would help clear my head. That's how I found myself in Devil's Staircase Wilderness, one of the most remote areas in Oregon. No trails, no cell service, no distractions. Just me, my old RV, and miles of untouched forest. I parked the RV at a gravel turnout near the edge of the wilderness, packed my gear, and set out on foot. I wasn't scared of getting lost. I'd spent years navigating worse terrain, but Devil's Staircase was unlike any place I'd ever been. The trees were so dense they blocked out the sun, casting everything in a gray, oppressive light. The air was heavy, damp, and oddly quiet. Too quiet. The first day went fine. I hiked deep into the forest, marking my route on a map. By evening, I found a small clearing to set up camp. That's when I noticed it, an old, abandoned campsite not far from mine. The tent was shredded, its poles bent at unnatural angles. Rusted cookware lay scattered around, and the trees nearby were gouged with deep claw marks. At first, I thought it was the work of a bear, but something about the scene didn't add up. The claw marks were too precise, almost deliberate, and the way the tent had been destroyed didn't look like a random attack. It looked calculated. I should have left right then and there. But I didn't. I told myself it was just an animal and forced myself to stay put. I even laughed at how jumpy I was feeling. Big mistake. That night, the forest came alive with sounds. At first, it was just the usual, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But as the hours dragged on, the noises became more intentional. Footsteps circled my camp, slow and deliberate. Once or twice, I called out, shining my flashlight into the darkness. No response. I didn't sleep much. I sat by the dying campfire, clutching my knife and waiting for morning. The footsteps eventually stopped, but the forest didn't feel any safer. If anything, the silence that followed was worse. The next day, I pushed further into the wilderness, hoping the physical exertion would clear my mind. Instead, I found something that made my stomach twist. Strange symbols carved into the trees. They looked like a cross between abstract art and hieroglyphs, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. They weren't old either. Whoever had made them had been here recently. I told myself it was just some hiker messing around, but deep down, I knew better. The symbols weren't random. They were a warning. By late afternoon, my GPS died. I wasn't worried. I had my map, and I knew how to navigate without it. But the terrain was rough, and the dense undergrowth made every step a struggle. I decided to make camp early, hoping to recharge my batteries, literally and figuratively. As I gathered firewood, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. At first, I thought it was an animal, but when I turned around, I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing just beyond the trees. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and piercing. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steady despite the fear creeping into my chest. No answer. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching. I backed away slowly, gripping my knife, and made my way to camp. When I turned to look again, it was gone. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and more insistent. They circled my camp again and again, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the trees. And then I heard it. A voice. Eric's voice? "Marcus," it called, soft and broken. "Why did you let me die?" My heart stopped. I knew it couldn't be him. Eric was gone. But the voice was so familiar, so real, that for a moment, I believed it. I stood, knife in hand, and called out, "What do you want from me?" The voice laughed. It wasn't Eric's laugh, it was something twisted, mocking. The fire suddenly flared, and in its light, I saw the creature. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed empty and hollow, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It took a step closer, and the air around me grew cold, suffocating. I ran. I don't remember grabbing my gear, but I must have, because I had my pack and flashlight as I tore through the forest. The creature followed, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. No matter how fast I ran, it was always there, just out of sight, herding me back toward the abandoned campsite. The forest seemed to twist around me, the trees forming a maze that pulled me deeper into its grip. My flashlight flickered and I stumbled, scraping my hands on the rough ground. When I looked up, the creature was there, standing between me and the path. It didn't move. It didn't have to. The creature stepped closer, and suddenly the forest dissolved. I was back in my childhood home, sitting on the floor of Eric's bedroom. He was there too, smiling at me, alive. For a moment, I forgot where I was. I forgot everything. "Marcus," he said, his voice soft, "why didn't you save me?" "I tried," I whispered. "I'm so sorry, Eric. I tried." His smile faded, and his face twisted into something horrible. "You let me die," he snarled, his voice overlapping with the guttural growl of the creature. The vision shattered, and I was back in the forest, gasping for air as the creature loomed over me. I don't know where the strength came from, but I fought back. I lit a flare from my pack, the bright light forcing the creature to recoil. It screamed, a sound that was part human, part animal, and lunged at me. I swung a burning branch at it, forcing it to retreat, but I knew I couldn't kill it. It was too powerful, too otherworldly. My only chance was to escape. I ran until I reached the abandoned campsite. The symbols carved into the trees glowed faintly, and I realized they weren't warnings. They were a trap. The creature had lured me here, using my guilt as bait. Desperate, I set the campsite on fire, using the last of my lighter fluid to ignite the rotting tent and debris. The flames roared to life, and the creature screamed again, its form flickering like a shadow in the light. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran through the forest, guided by the distant sound of the river, until I stumbled back to the RV. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and drove away, not stopping until the forest was miles behind me. I never went back to Devil's Staircase. I haven't been able to camp or hike since. But the creature isn't gone. I feel its presence in the quiet moments, in the shadows that linger just a little too long. I don't know what it wanted, but I know one thing for sure: the wilderness isn't empty. Something ancient and hungry is out there, waiting for the next lost soul to wander into its grip. My name is Nina Carter, and I'm 29 years old. This happened in the summer of 2022 in Tillamook State Forest, Oregon. I've told myself 100 times not to think about it, what we saw, what happened, but the memories always creep back when the world gets quiet. I know I'll never go camping again, and I don't think Dana will either. Jared, well, I'll get to that. It started as a weekend trip, something to break up the monotony of work and city life. Jared, Dana, and I had been friends for years, though we'd grown apart recently. Jared, 30 and always the thrill-seeker, suggested hiking to an abandoned fire lookout deep in Tillamook State Forest. "The views are insane," he promised. "We'll camp for the night, then head back. Easy." I wasn't thrilled about his plan. Jared had a habit of underestimating risks, but I went along anyway. I needed the break, and I thought some time in the woods might bring us closer again. Donna was less enthusiastic. At 28, she was the least outdoorsy of us, and the idea of camping in the middle of nowhere had her on edge. She agreed only after Jared teased her about being too uptight. We left Portland early on a Friday morning, Jared driving his beat-up RV down winding roads that seemed to shrink as we got closer to the forest. By the time we reached the trailhead, the air felt different, cooler, heavier, like the trees were holding their breath. I grabbed my camera, Jared stuffed an old map into his pack, and we started walking. The trail was easy at first, a soft dirt path shaded by towering Douglas firs. Birds chirped overhead, and the scent of pine filled the air. But as we moved deeper into the forest, the trail became harder to follow. Branches clawed at our arms, and the ground turned muddy in places, swallowing our boots. Dana complained about her pack being too heavy, but Jared just rolled his eyes. "You'll survive," he said, striding ahead like he knew exactly where we were going. About 2 hours in, I noticed the first strange thing, a cluster of rocks stacked in a perfect spiral on the side of the trail. It didn't look natural, and it didn't look like something a hiker would leave behind. "That's weird," I said, snapping a photo. Jared shrugged it off. "Forest art," he said. But Dana looked uneasy, her eyes darting to the trees as if someone might be watching. We kept going. The trail grew steeper, and the sunlight barely pierced the canopy overhead. I felt the quiet more than heard it, the way the usual forest sounds. Birds, rustling leaves, seemed to fade the farther we went. Then Dana stopped, crouching to pick something out of the dirt. "Is this a tooth?" she asked, holding up a small white object. It looked human. My stomach churned, but Jared waved it off. "Probably an animal's," he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. We made camp in a small clearing that night, setting up our tents around a fire Jared built. The flames cast flickering shadows on the trees, making the forest feel alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want Jared to call me paranoid. As we sat around the fire, eating instant noodles and joking about the day's hike, a heavy fog rolled in. It crept through the trees, muffling the world around us. Then came the noise. Soft at first, like distant footsteps. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Jared shrugged. "Probably animals." "Sounds like people," Dana said, her voice trembling. Jared stood, flashlight in hand, and scanned the trees. "There's no one out here but us," but I noticed the way his shoulders tensed, the way his eyes lingered on the shadows. That night, I woke to the sound of snapping branches. My heart pounded as I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, and in the faint light, I saw a figure moving between the trees. It was tall, gaunt, and moved with an unnatural grace. For a moment I thought it was a person, but something about the way it moved, jerky, almost insect-like, made my skin crawl. I held my breath, watching as it disappeared into the fog. The next morning, our camp was a mess. Jared's bag had been torn open, its contents scattered. Our water bottles were empty, though none of us had touched them. I found blood on the ground near the fire pit, fresh, bright red blood. "What the hell happened?" I asked, but no one had an answer. "We're close to the lookout," Jared said, avoiding our questions. "Let's just get there, take some pictures, and head back." We didn't argue. I think we all felt it. The sense that something was wrong, that we needed to leave, but we followed Jared anyway, deeper into the forest. We found the fire lookout by midday, or what was left of it. The tower was old and rotting, its wooden frame sagging under the weight of years. Inside, we found rusted tools, empty cans, and a crumbling journal buried under debris. The entries were barely legible, but what we could read chilled me to the bone. The journal belonged to a group of settlers from the 1800s. They wrote about starvation, about madness creeping into their minds. One entry described an offering to the spirit of hunger, a being they believed would spare them in exchange for a sacrifice. The last entry was a scrawl of jagged lines, like the writer had been shaking with fear. We didn't stay long. As we left the tower, the forest seemed to close in around us. The air grew colder, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long. I felt eyes on me, though every time I turned I saw nothing. Then we heard them. The voices, low and guttural, speaking a language none of us recognized. They came from all around us, echoing through the trees. "What is that?" Dana whispered, clutching my arm. "Keep moving," Jared said, but his voice wavered. The voices grew louder, closer. Then they stopped. A figure stepped out of the shadows ahead, a man, or what used to be one. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes glinted with an unnatural light, and his teeth, they were sharp, jagged. Behind him, more figures emerged, their movements slow and deliberate. They surrounded us, their faces twisted with hunger. Jared drew his knife, shouting at them to stay back, but it was no use. They closed in, their whispers rising to a deafening chant. Jared lunged at the nearest one, but they were too fast. They swarmed him, dragging him into the trees as he screamed. Dana and I ran, our packs forgotten, the forest blurring around us. I could hear them behind us, their footsteps impossibly fast, their voices like a storm in my ears. We stumbled into a ravine, our only escape through a narrow crevice in the rocks. We squeezed through, the jagged stone cutting our hands and arms. On the other side, the forest was eerily quiet. We didn't stop running until we saw the RV. By some miracle, it was untouched. We climbed in, locking the doors behind us, and Jared's keys were still in the ignition. As I drove, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see those figures chasing us down the road, but they never came. We never found out what happened to Jared. The authorities dismissed our story, chalking it up to stress and exhaustion. But I know what I saw, and I know I'll never go back to those woods. My name is Ethan Grayson, and I'm 36 years old. This happened last September, during a solo RV trip to the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon. I've spent the better part of my life photographing wildlife and landscapes, but this trip changed something in me. I don't talk about it anymore, not because I've forgotten, how could I, but because saying it out loud makes it feel more real, and I don't want it to feel real. The trip was meant to clear my head. My divorce had just been finalized, and the weight of my failures was unbearable in the stillness of my Portland apartment. I thought some time in nature, away from people and phone calls, would help me find peace, or at least distract me. The gorge seemed perfect. It was familiar yet vast enough to explore for days. I loaded up my RV, grabbed my camera gear, and headed east. The rain started as I approached the forest. Light at first, then steady. I didn't mind. The overcast sky would make for dramatic photos. I parked the RV at a secluded campsite near Eagle Creek, far enough from the main trails to avoid other hikers. The spot was beautiful, framed by towering Douglas firs and a faint view of the river below. But it was quiet. Too quiet. Even in the rain, I expected to hear birds or the rustle of animals. Instead, there was only the drip of water on leaves and the occasional creak of branches. I told myself I was imagining things, locked the RV, and set off on foot. I'd read about a hidden waterfall on an old hiking forum, supposedly located along an overgrown trail a few miles from my campsite. The directions were vague, and the trail itself was barely a path, more mud and roots than anything else. I had to stop several times to adjust my footing. cursing under my breath as my boots sank into the muck. The rain picked up and the fog thickened, muting the world around me. Every sound seemed amplified. The squelch of my boots, the rustle of wet branches, the patter of rain on my jacket. That's when I saw the first sign, an arch of rocks balanced impossibly on one another. It was just off the trail, small but deliberate. I knelt to take a photo, but as I focused the lens, something about the formation made me hesitate. The rocks weren't just stacked, they were carved, faint spirals etched into their surfaces. I snapped a quick picture and moved on, my pulse quickening. The farther I went, the stranger the forest became. I found a bird carcass impaled on a branch, its wings spread as if in flight. Then, a series of symbols carved into a tree, sharp lines forming a bridge-like shape. By the time I reached the waterfall, I wasn't sure if the dampness on my skin was rain or sweat. The waterfall was smaller than I'd expected, but beautiful, framed by moss-covered rocks and cascading into a shallow pool. I set up my tripod, trying to ignore the unease building in my chest. As I adjusted the focus, I thought I heard something. Soft, like a whisper carried on the wind. I turned, scanning the forest, but there was nothing. Just trees and mist. I told myself I was being paranoid, packed up my gear, and headed back. But the trail didn't look the same. It looped in ways I didn't remember, leading me past the same symbols, the same eerie markers. By the time I stumbled back to my campsite, night was falling, and I was soaked to the bone. The RV was a welcome sight, but something about it felt off. My headlights caught deep scratches along the side panel, long gouges in the metal like claw marks. My stomach twisted. Could it have been a bear? A cougar? I didn't wait to find out. I locked the doors, turned on every light inside, and sat at the small table, trying to calm my racing thoughts. That's when I noticed the journal. It was sitting on the dashboard, waterlogged and old. I hadn't put it there. I hadn't seen it before. My hands trembled as I opened it, the pages damp and sticking together. The writing was faded, but I could make out enough to feel my heart drop. The journal belonged to someone named Thomas Bennett, a hiker from the 1970s. He described camping near Eagle Creek, hearing whispers in the forest, and finding strange carvings. The entries grew more frantic, detailing a shadowy figure that followed him, a voice that called his name, and the feeling of being watched. The last page was barely legible. Beware the spirit of the bridge. It watches, it waits, it hungers. A loud thunk shook the RV, snapping me out of my trance. It sounded like something had hit the roof. My breath caught as I grabbed a flashlight and knife from the counter. The rain had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Slowly, I opened the door and stepped outside. The forest was pitch black, the trees looming like walls. I swept the flashlight across the clearing, but nothing moved. Then I saw them. Footprints in the mud, leading from the trees to the RV. They were large, barefoot, and oddly spaced, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them walked on the balls of their feet. The trail stopped just beneath the door, where the scratches were deepest. I climbed back inside, locking the door behind me, and sat in the driver's seat, gripping the knife tightly. Hours passed, the silence pressing in on me. Every creak of the RV felt like a threat, every shadow a warning. Finally, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke, the light outside was gray and dim, the forest shrouded in fog. But something was different. The scratches on the RV were gone, the mud wiped clean as if nothing had happened. I stepped outside cautiously, the air damp and cold. The footprints were gone too, but in their place, I found something worse. A small crude bridge made of sticks and moss placed directly in front of the RV. I don't remember packing up or driving away. All I know is that when I reached the nearest town, I parked the RV and locked myself in a motel room, trembling. I've looked at the photos I took that day, trying to make sense of it all. But every shot of the forest, the waterfall, even the campsite, they've all changed. The trees are twisted, the water black, and in every frame there's a shadowy figure, cloaked in mist, watching from a distance. I don't go to the gorge anymore, and I never camp alone. My name is Rachel Monroe, and I'm 42 years old. This happened in the summer of 2023, during what was supposed to be a peaceful solo RV trip to Siskiyou National Forest in Oregon. I haven't talked about it much, partly because people wouldn't believe me, and partly because I don't want to relive it. But the truth lingers in my nightmares, in the silence I can't escape. I run a travel blog, specializing in uncovering hidden gems and forgotten places. It's a career that sounds romantic on paper, living on the road, exploring remote destinations, but it's been more about running away. A year earlier, I lost my sister Amelia in a car accident. She'd been my best friend, my anchor. After that, staying still became unbearable, so I kept moving. And this trip was just one more escape. I'd read about a forgotten campsite in an old guidebook, buried in the pages of a section on Rogue River. The author mentioned a mining settlement nearby that had been abandoned in the 1800s after a series of disappearances. The place intrigued me. There was something poetic about photographing a site that had vanished from memory. I made it my next destination. The drive into Siskiyou was rough, the roads narrowing until the trees seemed to close in on me. My RV bumped over potholes, the radio cutting out as I lost the signal. Eventually, I arrived at what the guidebook had called the trailhead, though it was little more than a muddy patch of grass surrounded by dense forest. I parked, killed the engine, and stepped out into the damp, earthy air. The forest was ancient, the kind of place that feels untouched by time. Moss dripped from towering pines, and the ground was carpeted with ferns and decaying leaves. It was beautiful, but the stillness unsettled me. There were no bird calls, no rustling of animals, just an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional creak of branches. I shrugged it off, grabbed my gear, and set out on foot. The trail was faint, more of a suggestion than a path winding between trees and over roots slick with rain. As I walked, I began to notice strange things. Claw marks gouged into the trunks higher than any bear could reach. Small piles of golden dust near the rocks, as though someone had been panning for gold. A helmet, a rusted, old miner's helmet, hung from a low branch. I paused to take a picture, but something about it made me shiver. The words, "They watch at night," were scratched into the bark beneath it. I kept walking. The forest grew denser, the light dimmer, until I came across what remained of the mining settlement. It was nothing more than a collection of ruins, collapsed wooden frames, rusted tools, and a single stone chimney standing like a grave marker. In the middle of it all was a cave, its entrance partially collapsed and covered in ivy. I felt drawn to it, though I couldn't explain why. Inside, the air was cold and damp. I found a small leather-bound journal buried under debris. Its pages were waterlogged, the ink smeared, but I could make out enough to piece together the story. The journal belonged to a miner named Elias, who wrote about the settlement's final days. One entry described how a man betrayed his companions, leading them into a trap to claim the gold for himself. The betrayal unleashed a curse, and the miners began to disappear, one by one. The last entry read, "We are cursed to guard this place forever. Do not disturb the silence." I left the cave feeling uneasy, but the sinking sun pushed me back toward my RV. By the time I reached the clearing, night was falling, and a storm was brewing. Thunder rumbled in the distance as I climbed into the RV and locked the door. I told myself I was being silly, that the journal and the carvings were just stories, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I woke to a sound. A faint tapping on the window, soft and rhythmic. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear. The tapping stopped, replaced by a long, drawn-out scrape along the side of the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my breath catching in my throat. The rain had stopped, but the forest outside was shrouded in mist. The windows were fogged, the interior of the RV eerily quiet. I flicked on the flashlight and swept it across the clearing. At first, I saw nothing, just shadows and trees. Then, at the edge of the light, a figure emerged. It was tall and thin, its skin pale as bone and stretched taut over its frame. Its arms were unnaturally long, ending in clawed fingers that dragged across the ground as it moved. The creature didn't walk so much as glide, its head tilting in a way that made my stomach churn. Its face, its face was featureless, save for two black, empty pits where eyes should have been. It stopped just outside the beam of light. Its head cocked as though listening. Then, in a voice that didn't belong to it, it said my name. Rachel. The voice was wrong, distorted and hollow but unmistakably Amelia's. I froze, tears stinging my eyes. "No," I whispered, "you're not her." The creature took a step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Why did you leave me?" it said, the voice twisting with accusation. My hands shook as I backed away, fumbling for the door lock. It didn't try to follow. It just stood there, watching as I shut the door and bolted it behind me. For the rest of the night I sat at the table with the flashlight and knife, my ears straining for any sound. The whispers came first, soft and guttural, like a chorus of voices speaking just out of reach. Then the tapping returned, this time at every window, as though the creatures were surrounding me. I covered my ears and prayed for dawn. When the first light broke through the trees, the sounds stopped. The creatures were gone, but they'd left something behind. Small piles of gold dust arranged in a circle around the RV. I didn't waste time packing. I shoved my things into bags, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The road out of the forest felt longer than before, the trees closing in like a tunnel. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station hours later, shaking as I told the clerk I'd gotten lost and needed directions. That should have been the end of it. But when I developed my photos, I found them there. The pale watchers. In every frame, standing in the background, their eyeless faces turned toward me. I don't know what they wanted, but I do know this. Some places are meant to stay forgotten.